Jane McCall and the Twilight Stacks. Chapter 9. The Touch. She didn't pass out, but the creeping chill settling in her stomach and spreading to the tips of her fingers made her wish she had. She tried to move, but could only suppress the shivering which had taken hold of her hands. That made her lose what little emotional control she possessed. Messy tears fell down her cheeks as she let out hiccuping sobs. Half of her shivering was out of cold, but the other half was from fear. This was awful. It felt like it would never end. She tried to call out, but her voice got stuck in her throat. She let out a pathetic croak and cried harder. A little wet tongue in Jane's face distracted her. She opened her eyes to see Jess half an inch away, whining and licking every part of Jane she could reach. Her eyes shone with worry, and her ears drooped. It was a heartbreaking sight. The need to comfort the puppy gave Jane enough strength to lift one arm and pat the dog on the back. Jess buried her face under Jane's chin and snuggled in close. The pressure and texture helped to ground Jane, and she took deep breaths to steady herself. Once she could think again, she closed her eyes and assessed her situation. She was still shaky and jittery, but at least she was now coherent. Okay. So, little spells only. The fireball hadn't even been that big, but it had sapped her magic completely. On top of that, she'd nearly burned herself up from the inside. Her abdomen was still tender and aching. She rubbed her stomach to ease the pain. Once it subsided, she rolled to sit crisscross and hauled Jess into her lap. That was enough playing with spells for one day. Jane's magic had well and truly run empty, though a little spark had come back while she'd been on the ground. She didn't fancy passing out until her parents got home. They'd lose their minds. No thanks. Jane pulled her mark in. With one hand petting Jess and one hand working, Jane considered what she'd learned and added it to the criteria she'd put in her journal. The final list looked like this. Spellcasting requirements. 1. Mark must be in glove form. Flow of power is insufficient for use in band form. 2. A verbal incantation of some variety connected to the spell's function. 3. Visualization of the spell's effect. 4. Power draw is directly correlated with magnitude of spell effect. 5. My well of power is very, very small. Casting many spells in rapid succession is a no-go. Refill rate is slow. Training/age to fix. 6. More specific wording equals more power draw, but more accurate/predictable effect. 7. Power draw continues as long as spell effect is occurring. Type of spell affects power draw. 7a. Psychic type or information-based spells require a great deal of focus but the least amount of power compared to other types. Info overload a risk. Research these plus practice. 7b. Transformation spells require moderate power. Opening a lock or turning a card over are simple. Think of more spells of this variety. 7c. Transmutation spells require a great deal of power, but the draw stops at the transmutation's end. Greater changes and more complex starting or ending materials require more power. Transmutations are mass-dependent. 7d. For creation of physical objects, drain exists as long as the object does. Power draw is immense. Creation spells not recommended. Warning! Excess power use leads to weakness, internal overheating, chill, and potential unconsciousness or death. Use responsibly. She was sure there were more rules, but these were a good start. With that, she snapped the journal shut and let her mark go back to glove form. It was time to scramble her brain. The contact-based power was consistent, at least. It didn't draw magic from her. If anything, the phenomenon replenished her stores. Nothing happened when she touched non-living material in either state. The book thing earlier had been an accidental spell. Formerly living material didn't count either. A fallen leaf from one of the trees produced the same lack of reaction as a pebble and the plastic arm of her glasses. Jane couldn't deny the relief she felt upon confirming that. It meant that her cuff would prevent any accidental sense mangling if someone bumped into her wrist. The consequences of that would be ugly. On the other hand, contact with Jess made her eyes, ears, and nose go bonkers the same way each time. No variations, not even in the different states. She didn't test the feature extensively. The third time she touched the mark to Jess in rapid succession had her feeling sick enough to puke. She spent several minutes doing breathing exercises and fighting the nausea. She hesitated to touch anything else, but she needed to try with at least one other living thing. Her only easy option was the plant life around her. She hesitated before placing her fingertips on the bark of a pear tree. Touching the mark to the tree let her feel every inch of sunlight on her skin. It also filled her soul with a deep sense of peace and her mouth with the taste of its fruit. Same for the apple tree. Yuck! Grass gave a feeling of endurance and connection, and Clover felt the same but with the scent of the flower attached. None of the plants were as overwhelming as the dog, which was for the best. If the pear tree's peace had been any stronger, she'd have risked drifting away into it. She made plans to use it to de-stress during finals. Once she wrote down her findings, she gathered up her things and brought them inside. She put the lock back in its cabinet and tossed the dice and cards in the family's board game tote. The orange and kiwi became a snack. They tasted okay, but not quite right. Too sour, too much acidity, slightly off texture. Both of the flavors were duller and blander than any fruit Jane had tasted before. More the memory of a taste than a proper flavor. Jane considered the phenomenon for a while and made a subnote under the transmutation point. Transmuted food not as good as real food. Practice makes perfect, or fundamental flaw. When she checked her phone, she found the video of her spellcasting corrupted beyond salvaging. The 10-second clip she took of Jess after she found the first video worked perfectly well. Conclusion? Either magic as a whole didn't take too well to technology, or measures were in place to hide magic from anyone powerless by erasing evidence. Jane didn't have enough data either way, to be sure. She did her PT while thoughts about her magic's uses, implications, and connection to her quest whirled around her head. As a consequence, she didn't do as thorough a job as she should have. It bothered her a little, but she didn't want to overcompensate and risk a setback. She could let it go for one day. Her parents came home halfway through, and she gave them a distracted greeting. She set the table, ate dinner, and washed the dishes on autopilot. As soon as she could, she made a beeline for the computer. A search for spontaneous tattoo led to a bunch of results of people who got tattoos on impulse and ideas for getting one. Magic tattoo led to tattoos of potions, tabletop RPG mechanics, and tattoos which changed color under UV light. While cool, that didn't fit her situation either. A few more searches in a similar vein led to diddly squat, and she put the line of inquiry aside. The sense thing worked out much better. While searches into altered human senses had her half convinced she'd developed a catastrophic brain injury, an article about dog senses led to pay dirt. She scrolled through, getting more and more excited as each sense was discussed. Dogs were nearsighted and red-green colorblind. Their hearing covered more frequencies and greater distances. Most impressively, their sense of smell was absurdly good, capable of detecting smells humans couldn't even begin to sense. All of that aligned with what Jane had experienced while her mark was in contact with Jess. She hadn't gotten her own senses messed up, she'd borrowed the puppy's. She read a few more articles which affirmed her conclusion. She noted it in her journal, then made a half-cocked plan to pet a cat with her mark active. She didn't have easy access to a cat, but that was a problem for not running on second wind Jane. Current Jane was starting to get manic, which was her cue to take a shower and pass out. She did so with little fanfare. Queries, kudos, or concerns? Like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening.